let's look at the types of inflation. Number one type of inflation is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is an inflation that occurs as a result of increase in aggregate demand in a country. So an inflation that occurs because of increase in aggregate demand in a country is said to be demand pull inflation. What is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services in a country, which includes household consumption, firms' investment, government expenditure, and net export. If this increases in a country, it will bring about excess demand for goods and services that will result in higher prices of goods, or it will lead to increase in prices of goods and services. Number two is cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is an inflation that occurs as a result of increase in cost of inputs. So when there's increase in cost of inputs or cost of production, we are going to have a cost push inflation. An increase in cost of inputs, such as cost of raw materials, cost of salaries and wages. When this increases, it will bring about a reduction in aggregate supply that will make the price of goods and services to increase. Number three types of inflation, we have the creeping inflation. Creeping inflation is an inflation that occurs at a very slow rate. It is an inflation that occurs at a single digit, usually below zero, usually between 0 to 9%. So an inflation that is good for any economy is the creeping inflation because it stimulates aggregate demand in a country and also does not frustrate economic plans of the country. So one can plan with creeping inflation because it occurs at a very slow rate. The next type of inflation is hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is an inflation that occurs at a very fast rate. So any inflation that occurs at a very fast rate is called hyperinflation. It usually occurs in two digits, between 10 and 99%. So an inflation that occurs between 10 and 99% is said to be an hyperinflation. So an hyperinflation is not good for any economy because it frustrates economic plans of the country. All right. So hyperinflation can also be called galloping inflation. The other type of inflation is stagflation. Stagflation is an inflation that occurs simultaneously with unemployment. So any inflation that occurs simultaneously with unemployment is called stagflation. So stagflation occurs simultaneously with unemployment, which means that it is an inflation that coexists with what? Unemployment. So stagflation is against the principle propounded by Professor A.W. Phillips called Phillips curve because Professor A.W. Phillips did a research on developed economics in Europe. All right. In that research, he found out that inflation rate is inversely related to unemployment rate, but he never considered developing countries and underdeveloped countries like some in South America and in Africa. All right. So in South America and Africa, we have cases of stagflation because we have inflation rates occurring simultaneously with unemployment, which is against the principle propounded by Professor A.W. Phillips in Phillips curve. The last type of inflation is called spiral inflation. Spiral inflation is an inflation that occurs when a measure taken to solve a particular type of inflation leads to another kind of inflation. So in that case, we call such kind of inflation a spiral inflation. I always say to people that the kind of inflation we have in Nigeria is a spiral inflation because Government has been taking a lot of measures to solve the inflation. So it is leading to another kind of inflation. Such kind of inflation is said to be what? A spiral inflation, by my own observation.